Shut up about politics. Ain't nothing but a big pile of dirty tricks. I'm tired of all the fighting and a pitching fit, so shut up about politics.
Welcome back, folks. In our first set of videos about the political question doctrine and the separation of powers, we took a look at 6 rules articulated in Baker versus Carr to tell courts, or through which courts tell themselves, when to stay out of particular issues. We're going to consider only the first 2 of those now, starting with their rule about a textually demonstrable constitutional commitment of the issue to another branch. So let's see how seriously they took this rule in INS versus Chadha. And I'm going to suggest to you, not so seriously. What we're going to see is that they had really flipped things around since Luther versus Borden. Luther versus Borden essentially scoured the entire Constitution looking for reasons not to get involved in political questions. The modern court, on the other hand, has tended to look only at the express provision under consideration in the case and look for reasons to get involved. They only stay out, as I've suggested to you, when there's a clear no trespass sign. So here's the facts. Mr. Chadha was born in the British colony of Kenya to Indian parents. He was therefore a citizen of the United Kingdom and Colonies, as it was called at the time, and he entered the United States on a British passport when studying as a foreign exchange student. After Kenya's declaration of independence from Britain in 1963, he wasn't recognized as a legitimate citizen or resident of Kenya because his parents were Indian. Nor was he recognized as a legitimate citizen of India because he'd been born in Kenya. So he was in a bit of a bind. And the UK pulled his rights to live there because of his lack of connection to the United Kingdom. So he was in really a triple bind. After his non-immigrant student visa expired in 1972, none of the 3 countries would take him in anymore, rendering him, therefore, de facto stateless. The INS started deportation hearings against him, but an INS judge suspended the deportation because of a power which was given to the INS under the applicable law. But here's where the legal issue emerges in this case. Under the very same law, Congress had reserved the power to reverse any such decision by an INS judge. A judge within the bureaucracy is not part of the separate judicial branch. There are questions that emerge about whether Congress can actually defy a ruling by a court. A judge within an administrative bureaucracy is not the same. So here Congress had actually reserved to themselves the power to overrule such a decision if one house of Congress voted to do so. So it's what's called the unicameral legislative veto in this case. The House of Representatives vetoed the INS's suspension of deportation, therefore ordering Mr. Chadha deported. He challenged this, saying that the entire idea of the legislative veto violated the Constitution. Now, what specific clauses of the Constitution were in dispute in this case? 2 of them. First, the Naturalization Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. It gives Congress the power to, quote, establish an uniform rule of naturalization. Congress then combined this with the Necessary and Proper Clause, and they said that these 2 things together grant them an unreviewable authority over the regulation of aliens. But despite this clear provision in the Constitution, the court decided that Congress could not exercise the legislative veto because it violated a procedure in the Constitution. Chief Justice Burger discusses this on page 945 of the decision. He says, explicit and unambiguous provisions of the Constitution prescribe and define the respective functions of the Congress and of the executive in the legislative process. Now, of course, everybody knows that this power is shared, but as we learned from James Madison, that shared power had been carefully separated by specific procedures, separation of powers. Or as one scholar has put it, there are supposed to be separate institutions sharing powers. So in this case, the separate roles, sharing powers, are these. Both houses of Congress must pass a bill, that's in the Constitution, called bicameralism in this case. And then the bill is presented to the president for his signature or veto, that's called presentment in this case. Chief Justice Burger talks about the presentment issue on page 947 of the case, and he notes that during the final debate in the Constitutional Convention, James Madison had expressed concern that Congress might easily evade this presentment clause with the simple expedient of calling a proposed law a resolution or a vote rather than a bill. So what the Constitutional Convention did was they added another clause. They said, quote, every order, resolution, or vote must be presented to the president. Now, of course, we know that the presidential veto was only a second best procedure to Madison. What he had wanted was the Council of Revision. But if that was going to be the procedure, if the veto was going to be the procedure, he wanted it explicitly adopted for everything that Congress might pass. Then Burger talks about bicameralism on pages 949 to 950. He says that bicameralism was meant to keep Congress from acting too quickly or rashly. Think about Hamilton's concerns about the momentary inclinations that might wash over a legislative body. And he quotes Madison in Federalist 51 on this very same issue. Madison had said, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches and to render them, by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. So that was Madison's solution for, as it were, sort of slowing down the legislature so it wasn't taken up by rash considerations of a momentary nature. So Burger concludes that the Constitution is pretty clear. The procedure of lawmaking has to follow both bicameralism and presentment. But note something weird here. The Constitution states a procedure, but Burger turned it into a standard. Rather than saying that Congress and the president were empowered to fight it out over this issue, he claims that bicameralism and presentment are justiciable standards that the court can enforce. The Naturalization Bill, of course, had passed Congress. It had been signed by the president, and in that bill, the president agreed to give Congress a review power of this sort. So why should the court second guess it? If a procedure is given to those two branches and they followed it, can't they decide to divide their powers in a way that's convenient for them? That's one thing that Justice White actually picks up on in his dissent. He notices that bicameralism isn't actually that important to Justice Burger in his decision. Burger's problem wasn't just that the legislative veto in INS versus Chadha was unicameral, exercised by one house. Burger would have invalidated a legislative veto even if it were bicameral, passed by both houses. And even if the president had agreed to give Congress that power, Burger would have struck it down. So White says this is a sweeping decision that strikes down what is a very common practice in federal legislation. And he says that the court does this despite a, quote, textually demonstrable constitutional commitment, to use that phrase from Baker. He says there is such a commitment that gives this decision to the other two branches. If Congress and president were made to be separate institutions sharing powers, why not let them fight it out using their procedures? So White says this in his dissent on page 968. He's talking about the way that regulations essentially have the character of legislation, but Congress has to delegate the power to make regulations to the executive branch because really they can't possibly understand all the circumstances that some law of theirs is meant to apply to. So without the ability to oversee this regulatory process through something like a legislative veto, they can basically only do one of two things. They could write all laws in a super specific way, legislating about the minute details of human life. That's both impossible and creepy. Or they could abdicate all their power to the executive and administrative agencies, but that would be setting us on the road to precisely what the founders called tyranny, the bringing together of all these powers in one of the branches. So White says the court is basically giving inordinate amounts of power to the executive in the Chadha decision. If, in order to change any regulation, you need the approval of the president, she's going to veto almost everything. She'll have personal power to decide almost every regulation and whether it conforms with what Congress had intended. Rather than simply being the enforcer of rules that Congress makes, as the Constitution intended, she'd become much, much more. And at any rate, the president had agreed to these legislative vetoes when these bills were signed into law. The coordinate branches have agreed to share power in this way. So White says this is a political question. He says this in his dissent on page 974. He says the legislative veto hasn't made Congress overpowerful, as Madison had feared. Instead, he says, quote, rather, the veto has been a means of defense, a reservation of ultimate authority necessary if Congress is to fill its designated role under Article 1 as the nation's lawmaker. He's suggesting here that Congress is actually using the legislative veto to preserve the balance of powers, not to disrupt it, to preserve the constitutional order. And yet, at the same time, paradoxically, he argues that the legislative veto is not the power to make a new law. Any new law, whatever a law is, would have to be bicameral and presented to the president. But, White says this on page 980, he says, the veto must be authorized by statute and may only negative what an executive department or independent agency has proposed. So let me explain that, as I'll do after every quote I use, and as you'll do in your writings as well. Because what he was saying here, in other words, was that all that really the Congress can do is say no to something here. They can't say, do it this way instead. They're not making a law. That sort of command, do it this way, would be a law. Saying no to some regulatory action is not. And he argues that Madison would have really had no problem with this. There's no evidence that the presentment clause was meant to be that far-reaching. So he says this, White does, on page 981. He's talking about the same debate about the legislature evading the presentment clause and the assertion of those words, every order, resolution, or clause. He says, quote, the chosen language, Madison's comment, and the brevity of the convention's consideration all suggest a moderate role was intended for the clause, and no broad restraint on congressional authority was contemplated. And White says that the court's ruling is basically blind to the process of legislation in modern America. Congress is always delegating. When, for instance, the law says something like, people should keep their grass mowed except when there's a drought and using a lawnmower might start a fire, well, the executive of that law really has to be given discretion to decide when there's a drought and a fire hazard. Laws just can't be written that have no need of administrative application. So White makes this argument on page 985. He talks about the court in the past allowing such delegations as long as Congress had what's called an intelligible principle. The intelligible principle would be something that the executive is supposed to follow. Then he would say, Congress is engaged in the process of lawmaking. It's telling the executive, do this thing, which is intelligible, which the executive can figure out. They can't just give the president power to do anything with respect to lawn mowing or whatever it might be. They have to create rules for how and what powers are going to be used. That's legislation. But White asks, would the court allow Congress to delegate power to the president, but not allow Congress to oversee how the president uses it? Not allow them to block the bureaucracy sometimes with something like a veto? If so, then the court isn't preserving the constitutional order. It's actually tilting that order decidedly toward the president and away from the legislative branch. And here's the thing. Despite the ruling in INS versus Chadha, the legislative veto continues to be used widely to this day. Yeah, sure, bicameral ones for the most part, but still the legislative veto. Congress and the president consider it to be necessary to doing their jobs. So I look forward to discussing a test case that's going to have to do with the political question doctrine and separation of powers when we meet together. I'll see you then.